The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
After he had fed the people, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and precede him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. At once, Jesus spoke to them. "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught Peter and said to him, "O you of little faith, why do you doubt?" After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise be to the Lord Jesus.
Several weeks ago, I found it was tradition for new deacons to preach on the first weekend of ordination. I found that out from the two older guys over there. So here we go. First one out of the box. Like our own personal storms or earthquakes, certain events in our daily lives can overcome us. With the busyness and the hectic pace of life, we can be going along just fine 1 minute, and all of a sudden, we find ourselves tossed about by some unexpected situation. Try as we might, we can become powerless to control that situation. Just trying to keep ourselves steady can exhaust us and cause us to lose focus. That's the way Jesus must have felt leading into today's gospel. Prior to what we heard in today's gospel, we find that Jesus had learned that John the Baptist had been beheaded by King Herod. The shock of losing his kinsman in such a brutal way must have been devastating news for Jesus. So, like anyone dealing with the loss of a family member, he wanted to be alone, which would explain why Jesus then gets into a boat and moves off, seeking a deserted place to be by himself. Word traveled fast back then, and before long, the people in the surrounding towns heard that Jesus was nearby. So it didn't take long for them to leave the villages and flock to him, curious to see this prophet whom they've heard so much about, the one who speaks of God as a father and who loves and forgives and can heal their sick. Matthew then recounts the feeding of the 5,000. We're all familiar with that story and how it begins with an exchange between Jesus and his disciples over what to do over the huge and hungry crowds. Often we forget that Jesus was human, completely human, just like you or I. So being human, he would have felt the same things we would feel. Jesus must have been shaken at learning of the death of John the Baptist, wanting and not having any time to mourn John's death, plus being overwhelmed by the crowds, which must have left him emotionally drained and physically exhausted. Which brings us to today's gospel. People sometimes wonder, why did Jesus make the disciples get into a boat and sail off to the other side? Matthew's pretty specific on this point. He made them get into the boat. I suppose Jesus did it so he could dismiss the crowds himself and then go off to the mountain and pray in silence. Perhaps having the disciples around would have just distracted and further drained him. Throughout the Gospels, we often hear of Jesus going off alone to pray, sometimes early in the morning, other times, like in today's Gospel, near the end of a long day. Regardless, Jesus understood that he needed alone time so he could pray and make sense of what had just happened. Certainly, he wanted to be alone in silence with his Father, to open himself up to hear his Father and in turn speak to him. Jesus needed the silence so that the Father could guide him, counsel him, and refresh him. Like Elijah in the first reading, Jesus found his Father not in the powerful forces of nature, but in the tiny, whispering sound that came in the calm and the silence of being in solitude. Sometimes, try as we might, we can be powerless to control the situations that come our way. Just trying to keep from being overwhelmed can take everything out of us and distract and confuse us. These situations can sometimes be self-adjusting, meaning no matter what we do, we only make it worse, especially when we immediately react in the heat of the moment without thinking it through. Peter sort of falls into that category, at least when it comes to today's gospel. In a way, the disciples found that out too as they sailed that evening. True, many of them were seasoned sailors and fishermen. They would have been used to the winds and the waves that periodically came up on the sea and would have known how to deal with them. But on this night, it was all they could do to keep their little boat from capsizing from the wind and the waves. The constant battering of the waves against the side of the boat was just too much for them, and they became exhausted. I can imagine that as the night went on, everything they did brought them one step closer to disaster. Then Jesus appeared to them in the midst of all that turmoil. It's no wonder that the exhausted and now terrified disciples thought they were seeing a ghost. It was only when Jesus called out, "Take courage, it is I," and then stepped into the boat, bringing Peter with him, that the wind died down and the sea became calm. And in that instant, they recognized who Jesus really was, the Son of God. The fact of the matter is that God is always with us, even in the most chaotic times. He never leaves us. He's ever faithful. He's always there ready to hold out his hand and strengthen us. Indeed, that's the good news to be found in today's gospel message. The challenge is learning to find God first in the tiny whispering sounds of the quiet moments we experience in our daily lives, and then to allow God to bring the inner calm to us, even in the ferocious winds, the devastating earthquakes, and the raging fires of our lives.